What Victorian dating was really like. Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to a time of lace gloves, calling cards, and heartbreak conducted entirely through the post. A time when saying "I like you" was considered scandalous, and showing your ankle could end your reputation before dessert. Yes, tonight, we're stepping into the anxious, over-polished world of Victorian romance, where passion was a problem, flirting was a minefield, and love was something best expressed with chrysanthemums and restraint. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Pour yourself a cup of something soothing, preferably not laudanum, and let's wander softly into the candle-lit parlor of courtship. Victorian style. Victorian dating wasn't really dating at all. That would have been far too straightforward. It was more like a theatrical production, carefully staged, full of rules, and usually directed by a very determined mother. For men and women of the middle and upper classes, everything about courtship was dictated by etiquette. There were rules about when you could meet, how you could speak, what you could say, and, crucially, how often you could pretend not to notice one another in public. Romance was not spontaneous. It was scheduled, even. Your emotions had to make appointments. Let's start at the beginning. The introduction. No respectable Victorian lady could meet a man on her own. That would have been socially catastrophic, like turning up to a funeral in your bathing costume. Introductions had to be made by someone of good standing. A friend, a family member, or, ideally, a chaperone who could hover over the entire conversation like a moral hawk. And even once you'd been introduced, you were not permitted to know each other. Not yet. That required visiting rights. A man could not simply call upon a lady's home uninvited. He had to send his calling card first. A small, white rectangle engraved with his name and, if he was particularly pompous, his title. If the lady or her mother accepted, the card would be returned with a handwritten note. At home, on Thursday. This was not, as it sounds, an invitation to move in. It meant he was allowed to stop by between the hours of 3 and 5 for a supervised conversation lasting no longer than 20 minutes. It was like speed dating, but with more upholstery. Now, when he arrived, the real performance began. The lady would sit elegantly in the drawing room, often surrounded by relatives or other visitors. A human barrier to ensure no fun could possibly occur. The gentleman would bow. She would curtsy. Everyone would pretend. This was a normal way to interact. Conversation was polite, shallow, and excruciatingly slow. They could talk about the weather, the opera, or perhaps a recent sermon. They could not talk about politics, emotions, or anything that might suggest an actual personality. It was less flirtation and more verbal chess, but everyone's asleep. If the visit went well, the gentleman might be invited back, always during daylight, always supervised, always brief. And thus began what Victorians called paying court. It was a delicate balancing act. Too many visits, and the lady looked desperate. too few, and she risked being forgotten. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitation mattered. This was romance, as performed through subtext and tea. Of course, Victorians adored symbols. They turned flirtation into a code. Subtle gestures that could be deciphered only by the very observant, or the very bored. Fans, for example, were not simply for cooling oneself. They were tools of silent communication. Holding the fan to one's heart meant, "I love you." Fanning quickly meant, "We are being watched." Closing it sharply meant, "Leave me alone," and dropping it. Well, that was practically a marriage proposal. Gloves had meanings too. Dropping a glove was a signal of interest, if done delicately enough. But actually, picking up a dropped glove without permission? That was tantamount to seduction. In a culture that feared eye contact, accessories carried a heavy burden. Meanwhile, flowers became their own language. Literally, Victorians loved their floriography, a code that assigned romantic meaning to every bloom. A red rose meant love. A yellow carnation meant rejection. A wilted bouquet meant, "Please stop sending me these." Books were published to decode the meanings so lovers could communicate in fragrant, plausible deniability. Sending the wrong bouquet could spell disaster. A bouquet of marigolds, for example, meant jealousy. One of lavender meant distrust, which makes you wonder how many engagements were ended by bad horticulture. Letters were the next stage. Cautiously written, deeply censored, and usually read by someone else before being delivered. The tone had to be formal, yet affectionate, intelligent but not clever, passionate but not too passionate. It was like writing a love letter for an audience that would later grade it. Women were warned to avoid excessive exclamation points or emotional language, as this could indicate unfeminine enthusiasm. Men were warned to avoid flattery that might be mistaken for sincerity. Courtship correspondence was less about romance and more about proving one's ability to write coherent sentences without revealing the soul. Still, letters mattered. In a world where physical contact was nearly forbidden, words were the only form of intimacy allowed. Some couples courted entirely by post, sending letters that would take days to arrive, each one more cautiously phrased than the last. It was love by semaphore. Naturally, all of this took place under the watchful eye of the chaperone, that silent sentinel of virtue. No Victorian lady was ever truly alone with a man. Even a walk in the garden required supervision. If they sat on a bench, the chaperone sat beside them. If they strolled by the lake, she followed closely enough to overhear every sigh. It was a system designed to prevent temptation, or, failing that, to make it as awkward as possible. For the chaperone herself, it was thankless work. Long afternoons of pretending not to notice flirtation conducted through coughs and coded phrases. Her role was part bodyguard, part moral scarecrow. If she did her job well, nothing happened. If she failed, everything did. Occasionally, though, things got complicated because no amount of etiquette could stop people from being human. Behind closed doors, scandal brewed constantly. Servants whispered, letters went astray, fans fluttered a little too eagerly, and if a couple crossed the line, even slightly, the consequences were severe. For men, a ruined reputation could be inconvenient. For women, it was fatal. A single rumor could end a girl's chances of marriage, employment, or even social existence. So discretion wasn't just politeness. It was survival. And yet, for all their rules, Victorians were constantly obsessed with what happened when those rules were broken. Their novels were full of it. Fallen women, seduced maidens, tragic governesses. Every public scandal was devoured with horrified delight. Moral outrage was the favorite national pastime. Now, not everyone lived by these suffocating rules. The working classes, far removed from drawing rooms and debutante balls, had a more practical approach to romance. Courtship. There was less about propriety and more about proximity. You met at church, or in the market, or during the Sunday promenade. You courted openly, often without chaperones, because everyone already knew everyone else's business anyway. Still, even among the poor, reputation mattered. A woman known to have walked out with too many men might find herself quietly excluded from offers. And while upper-class women feared gossip, working-class women feared hunger. Marriage wasn't just romantic, it was survival. As for the middle class, they lived in the delicate in-between, desperate to imitate the nobility, but too busy working to live like them. Middle class. Courtship was filled with polite anxiety. Every move had to project both virtue and ambition. A young woman might play piano too, display her refinement, but not too well, lest she seem professional. A man might boast of his career, but not of his income, which would have been vulgar. The ultimate goal wasn't passion, it was stability. Marriage was a social merger. You weren't marrying for love. You were marrying for fit. Ideally, your families matched in fortune and reputation. Your temperaments aligned. Your future children would be reasonably attractive and morally sound. Love could come later, if at all. Of course, for some people, the system worked beautifully. Victorian romance, when successful, was full of tenderness, quiet glances, thoughtful gestures, and the shared understanding that love, like everything else, had to be earned through patience. And when couples did fall deeply in love, it was all the more intense for being forbidden. Think of Queen Victoria herself, who adored her husband, Prince Albert, with almost alarming devotion. After his death, she mourned him for 40 years, wearing black until her own. It's easy to mock the era's restraint. And yet, beneath the lace and rules, there was genuine feeling. It was just buried under several layers of etiquette and whalebone. By the end of the 19th century, though, cracks were beginning to show. Newspapers printed personal ads. Train travel allowed couples to escape chaperones. Telegraphs made flirtation faster. And in the cities, anonymity bred freedom. The world was changing, and so were the rules. Victorian dating was still a performance, but the stage lights were dimming. Modern love was waiting in the wings. So, what was Victorian dating really like? It was equal parts elegance and anxiety. A long, delicate performance in which everyone knew the choreography, but pretended they didn't. What happened to forgotten royal children? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, lonelier corner of royal history. It's late, the fire's burning low, and somewhere in a vast medieval palace, a nurse is walking softly through cold corridors, carrying a baby the world will soon forget. You know the stories of kings and queens, of great heirs and tragic favorites. But for every golden-haired prince or pampered princess whose name still echoes in history books, there were others, dozens of them, who simply disappeared. Some were sent away to monasteries, some were married off into obscurity, and some simply stopped being mentioned at all. Because in royal families, where every birth was political and every child was a potential pawn, there was no such thing as unconditional love. So tonight, let's drift back to the palaces and nurseries of Europe's most powerful dynasties, to meet the sons and daughters who were born to crowns, and then quietly erased from the story. Royal children as political currency. In most royal families, children weren't really people. They were assets. Each birth was a sort of dynastic coin toss. Maybe you'd get a strong heir who could secure the line, or maybe another daughter who'd have to be traded away in marriage like a diplomatic letter sealed in silk. Every royal nursery was full of expectation and anxiety. Nurses whispered prayers over bassinets. Courtiers speculated on which child had the look of kings. And somewhere, a royal mother was already worrying whether her son's existence made her other children less useful. It sounds cold, and it was. But monarchy was, at its heart, a business of survival. Too many heirs could be as dangerous as too few. The forgotten royal children were the ones who existed in that awkward middle space, not important enough to rule, not rebellious enough to execute, just quietly unnecessary. And in a world where royal life revolved around inheritance, being unnecessary was almost the worst fate imaginable. The spare problem. Let's start with the classic example. The spare. It's a term that still floats around today. The heir and the spare. The firstborn son was the future king. The second was the insurance policy. But what happens when the spare wasn't needed anymore? When the heir grew up healthy and produced heirs of his own? That's when the spares became dangerous. Princes without thrones were a liability, too royal to ignore, but too expendable to trust. They were magnets for rebellions, hostages in waiting, or just inconvenient reminders that succession could go wrong. And so, many of them were quietly removed from the chessboard. Some were given bishoprics, despite having no interest in religion. Some were packed off to distant castles, under polite house arrest, and some just faded from record, absorbed into the shadows of family politics. Let's drift to France, first, where forgotten royal children were practically a national specialty. The French spares who vanished. The French royal family, the Capetians, had a simple rule. Every son got something, but not too much. You might become the Duke of this or the Count of that, but never powerful enough to challenge your elder brother. The result was generations of disgruntled younger princes, all mildly furious and mildly irrelevant. One of the best examples was Charles of Valois, younger brother of King Philip IV, in the early 1300s. Charles spent most of his life hovering near power, but never quite touching it. Forever the ambitious uncle, the cousin with too many schemes and not enough crowns. His descendants would eventually inherit the throne. But Charles himself died just another almost king. And for every Charles, there were dozens more who didn't even get that far. Their names appear once or twice in baptismal records or royal chronicles, and then vanish. Sometimes they died young, but sometimes not. Sometimes they were simply sent to monasteries before they were old enough to protest. Because the church, conveniently, was a great place to store unwanted royalty. The monastic solution for centuries, the most respectable way to erase a royal child, was to make them holy. A son who wasn't needed for the throne could be given to God, which was politically tidy and spiritually fashionable. And so, across Europe, Citi Hiudi der Tontine quarter free, the abbeys filled with small boys who had once been princes. They were tonsured, robed, and renamed. Their royal titles vanished with their hair. In some cases they were genuinely devout. In others, they were simply trapped, living quiet, obedient lives behind monastery walls, while their siblings ruled the world outside. One of the most haunting examples was Prince John of Bohemia, son of King Ottokar II in the 13th century. Sent to a monastery as a child, he grew up hearing the echoes of court life in his prayers. His older brother took the throne, while John grew old in the cloister, known only as Brother John, the monk who could have been a king. It sounds peaceful in a way, but for many, it was just another form of gilded imprisonment. And this system didn't just apply to sons. Royal daughters were even easier to vanish. The quietest daughters in Europe, in the medieval world, royal daughters were valuable only until they married. After that, they became someone else's problem. If a princess couldn't be married off, because of lack of alliances, lack of dowry, or inconvenient birth order, there was always the convent. Convents were like polite storage units for surplus nobility. They kept the family's reputation intact, preserved the illusion of piety, and, most importantly, prevented idle daughters from marrying anyone unsuitable. Take Harotitamantran Fag Tidib Meet, for instance, Joan of England, one of King John's many daughters. She was briefly promised in marriage to a foreign prince, but when that fell through, she was simply placed in a nunnery. The chronicles note her piety. They do not mention whether she volunteered. And then there was Mary of Burgundy, who spent her life in the convent of Poissy, visited occasionally by her royal relatives, admired for her embroidery, and otherwise ignored. These women weren't mistreated necessarily. They were fed, clothed, and prayed for, but they were also quietly erased, existing at the edges of the royal family's memory, preserved only in the occasional list of monastic benefactors. The children who died. Twice, but perhaps the saddest group of all were the royal children who died in infancy, and then were forgotten entirely. In an age of high child mortality, even kings lost babies regularly, but only some of those losses were remembered. If a royal child died before baptism, or before their political use could be established, their memory often disappeared completely. Chroniclers might mention a birth, and then fall silent. The burial would be quiet, the name recycled for the next child, and history would move on. Some of these infants were buried in secret chapels, beneath the floors of castles or cathedrals, tiny tombs without inscriptions. Others were simply lost to time, their resting places unmarked. The irony, of course, is that in a world obsessed with lineage, so many royal lines began and ended in silence, even in the glittering courts of Europe. The royal nursery was not a place of joy. It was a place of anxiety, calculation, and quiet heartbreak. The Tudor example. A family of ghosts, England, as always, took this to extremes. The Tudors, famous for their surviving drama, were haunted by the memory of all the children who didn't make it into the history books. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the dynasty, had 8 children. Only 4 survived infancy. The rest were quietly buried. Their names, Edmund, Catherine, Elizabeth, barely remembered outside genealogical charts. Even Henry VIII, whose obsession with producing a male heir reshaped Europe, lost at least 3 children in infancy before Edward VI was born. Those lost babies, once prayed over by the entire kingdom, became invisible almost immediately after death. And for those who survived, life wasn't necessarily kinder. Princess Mary, later Mary, Bloody Mary, though she was more miserable than monstrous, spent her youth alternately pampered and exiled. Depending on her father's marital situation, Princess Elizabeth, her half-sister, grew up half-forgotten herself, declared illegitimate, restored, and ignored again in an exhausting loop of royal attention deficit. Even Edward, the longed-for son, grew up isolated, constantly ill, and dead by 15. So when we talk about forgotten royal children, it's not always obscurity that erases them. Sometimes it's too much attention, followed by too sudden a silence. The royal orphans, and then there were the orphans. Children whose parents died in war, rebellion, or scandal, leaving them politically radioactive. One haunting example is Margaret of Anjou's son, Edward of Westminster, the only child of Henry VI. He was just 17 when he died in battle during the Wars of the Roses, his body left on the field. With his death, his father's line ended, and his name faded almost immediately, overshadowed by the Tudors who came after. But not every orphan met a violent end. Some simply slipped through the cracks. In the late 14th century, the daughters of Charles the Bad of Navarre were married off to minor nobles scattered across Europe and effectively erased. Their father's infamy, and yes, Charles the Bad, is one of history's less subtle nicknames, made them political liabilities, so they disappeared into provincial estates, leaving behind no portraits, no monuments, just a few signatures on dusty dowry papers, and yet each of them had once been a princess. How did people in the Middle Ages really go bald? Tonight, we're drifting back to a world before shampoo commercials, before biotin gummies, before the comforting illusion that we can somehow reverse hair loss in just 3 weeks. Yes. Tonight, we're easing gently into one of history's quieter, more relatable struggles. Baldness. Medieval Europe. The land of knights, plagues, and suspiciously pointy shoes was also a place full of men quietly realizing that their foreheads were getting larger every year, and women doing their best not to mention it. Because, as it turns out, hair loss was just as common then as it is now. Maybe even more so. Diets were worse, hygiene was debatable, and genetics were, well, often disastrously inbred. So tonight we'll wander, slowly and calmly, through the follicular history of the Middle Ages. We'll explore what caused baldness, what people thought caused baldness, and what they tried to do about it. Spoiler, none of it worked, but they tried anyway. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights, and let's drift back to a world where men rubbed pigeon droppings on their heads and called it science. The medieval head of hair. Symbol. Status and superstition to understand medieval baldness. We first have to understand medieval hair, because hair in the Middle Ages wasn't just hair. It was identity. Long hair meant power, youth, and virility. Priests cut their hair short to show humility. Monks shaved the tops of their heads entirely, a style called the tonsure, because nothing says, "I've renounced the world," like a shiny bald circle in the middle of your scalp. Kings and knights, meanwhile, prided themselves on their manes. Think of Richard the Lionheart, or, as his contemporaries called him, Ricardus Anglorum Leonis Pilosus Capitis, which I just made up. But you believed me for a second, didn't you? Anyway, the point is, hair meant something. Losing it, therefore, meant losing part of your status. A receding hairline wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a visible sign that God, time, or your parents' questionable genetic decisions had decided your peak years were over. And, as usual in medieval Europe, people found creative ways to blame themselves for it. Why medieval people went bald? Let's start with the obvious: genetics. If your father went bald, you probably would too. But in a society where marrying your cousin was not only acceptable but encouraged, you didn't need to be a geneticist to see where this was heading. Royal families, in particular, had a rough time. The Habsburgs, for instance, were so inbred that they developed an entirely new facial shape. But their hairlines didn't fare much better. Portraits show a steady retreat of hair across generations, as if even the follicles were trying to escape the family tree. Then there was nutrition. Medieval diets were heavy on bread, ale, and wishful thinking. Vitamins were limited, and iron deficiency was common. And since hair follicles are surprisingly demanding, requiring protein, zinc, and all sorts of nutrients medieval peasants didn't have words for. It's no wonder many people thinned early. Then add disease, chronic infections, high fevers, parasites, all could trigger temporary or permanent hair loss. Leprosy, for example, sometimes caused eyebrows and eyelashes to fall out, creating the classic biblical prophet aesthetic nobody asked for. And of course, stress. Imagine living through the 14th century. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the ongoing confusion of why your shoes curled up at the ends. If anyone deserved stress-induced alopecia, it was them. The medical explanations, spoiler, they're terrible medieval doctors, as usual, had theories. Most were based on the humoral system. The idea that your body was a delicate stew of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you lost your hair, it was because your humors were unbalanced. Specifically, baldness was blamed on an excess of heat and dryness in the head. Men, being hotter and drier by nature, according to Galen, not logic, were more prone to baldness than women, which, in fairness, is roughly true, though their reasoning had more to do with philosophy than endocrinology. The solution, therefore, was to cool and moisten the head. Some physicians recommended cold compresses made of herbs and oils. Others suggested rubbing the scalp with animal fat, vinegar, or, for reasons we'll never quite forgive, freshly ground pigeon droppings mixed with honey. And yes, that was a real treatment. The medieval logic was simple. Pigeon droppings are moist and full of vital warmth. Therefore, they might stimulate hair growth. Of course, so is soup. But no one thought to try that. The recipe for regret. Let's look at a few genuine medieval remedies for baldness, as found in the medical texts of the time. One 13th century recipe recommended mixing bear grease with horseradish and nettle juice, then rubbing it vigorously into the scalp until it tingled. Another advised boiling leeks in vinegar and applying the mush daily. And then there's the Trotula, a famous 12th century medical compendium from Salerno, written for women's health, which offers this gem. Take ashes of burned bees, mix with olive oil, and anoint the bald spot, and the hair will grow again. It will not. But imagine the scent, a mix of singed bee and medieval optimism. There were also treatments involving onions, garlic, wine, and the blood of animals, especially bats, whose supposed nightly vitality was thought to transfer to the scalp. In essence, medieval baldness cures read like recipes written during a fever dream by someone standing too close to a torch. The religious angle, of course. If medicine failed, which it did spectacularly, there was always faith. Hair, after all, was considered a divine gift, so losing it could be seen as a form of punishment or divine message. Some monks even interpreted their natural baldness as a sign of holiness, calling it a crown of humility. Convenient, really. If your tonsure started spreading naturally, you could just pretend it was God doing it for you. There are even sermons from the period comparing hair loss to spiritual shedding. The idea that as the body loses vanity, the soul grows closer to purity. A nice thought. Though one suspects most men would have preferred to be spiritually impure with a full head of hair, wigs, hats, and strategic design choices now. Not everyone gave up and accepted their gleaming destiny. Some medieval men tried to disguise baldness the old-fashioned way, with hats. Lots of hats. Hats were fashionable, practical, and conveniently shaped to hide the retreating hairline. Wealthy men wore elaborate chaperones or coifs, while monks and scholars favored plain caps that doubled as portable warmth and camouflage. Cigs, interestingly, weren't common in early medieval Europe. They became fashionable later, in the 16th and 17th centuries. But even before that, there's evidence that some nobles experimented with artificial hairpieces, especially in Italy and France. Of course, wigs were expensive and uncomfortable, and medieval hygiene being what it was, they also attracted lice. Nothing quite ruins the illusion of youth like pausing mid-banquet to scratch your scalp vigorously. So, for most men, the simplest solution was acceptance. Or, if you were really bold, you leaned into it. Some monks shaved their entire heads clean, a look that said, "Yes, I'm bald, but it's for Jesus." The double standard. Women and baldness. We don't often hear about women going bald in the Middle Ages. But it happened, and the reactions were predictably hysterical. For women, hair was tied deeply to beauty and virtue. Medieval poets compared it to sunlight, silk, or even divine radiance, which made losing it something close to a personal apocalypse. Female baldness could result from illness, malnutrition, or overzealous fashion. Some styles involved tightly plucking the hairline to create a high forehead, considered elegant and noble. This, of course, sometimes led to permanent damage. So, yes, some women were accidentally self-inflictedly bald, in pursuit of beauty standards that required a head that looked just slightly aerodynamic. There were also cases of chemical burns from medieval cosmetics, mixtures of vinegar and quicklime used to remove unwanted hair. Applied too much, and congratulations! You've invented the world's first home laser treatment. In short, medieval women often went bald for the same reason modern women do: vanity, poor advice, and bad luck. Only theirs came with fewer dermatologists. Baldness and identity. Despite the shame often attached to baldness, not everyone viewed it negatively. In fact, some medieval thinkers argued that bald men were smarter. The reasoning? A big, shiny head meant there was more room for brains, which, to be fair, is still occasionally used as a coping mechanism today. Philosophers, scholars, and clergy were often bald, either naturally or by choice, and this gave the look a sort of intellectual respectability. The great medieval theologian Peter Lombard was reportedly bald. So was Pope Gregory VII. Even Charlemagne, who may have been thinning by middle age, leaned into the regal dignity of it. After all, who needs curls when you have an empire? So yes, baldness could, under the right lighting, be seen as wisdom, or, at the very least, inevitability with dignity. When baldness becomes fashion by the late Middle Ages, hairstyles changed constantly, and with them, attitudes toward baldness. Men began shaving parts of their heads intentionally to create stylish contrasts. Knights cropped their hair short under helmets. Scholars kept it tidy for practicality. What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of the medieval world. One that smells faintly of iron, wood smoke, and mild discomfort. It's late. The candles are flickering, and somewhere in a medieval town square, an executioner is polishing his axe, but not because there's anyone to decapitate tonight. He's just bored. You see, the life of a medieval executioner was a little like that of a freelancer with a very niche skill set. When there was work, it was dramatic, unpleasant, and very public. And when there wasn't, well, they had to find something else to do. Because bills, as it turns out, existed even in the Middle Ages. And so, tonight, we're going to gently unravel the oddly quiet, surprisingly domestic, and sometimes rather awkward life of the medieval executioner, in those long stretches between jobs. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift back to a time when your local hangman might also have been the guy who sold you sausages at the market. The man behind the hood, the E.T., image we have of the executioner. Tall, masked, standing ominously beside a chopping block, is mostly a Hollywood creation. In reality, executioners didn't usually wear masks, partly because it's hard to see what you're doing through a sackcloth hood, but also because everyone in town already knew who they were. There was no mystery. Everyone knew the executioner's name, his face, his family, and probably what he owed at the tavern. In small towns, anonymity wasn't an option, especially when your job involved chopping heads off the neighbors. That recognition came with a curse. The executioner's social status was somewhere between rat catcher and corpse. They were necessary, but unclean. Literally unclean, according to medieval theology. Handling blood, especially that of criminals, was seen as polluting. So while the executioner might have been officially employed by the city, he couldn't really eat, drink, or even marry like a normal person. In some towns, he and his family had to live outside the walls, near the gallows or the river. You know, a nice scenic spot for reflection and mild trauma. But here's the strange thing. For all that stigma, the job was often hereditary. Fathers passed it to sons. Sometimes entire families became dynasties of executioners. In Nuremberg, there were generations of the same family carrying out executions for over a century. Like a very dark family business with strong job security. And naturally, when there were no executions, they still had to make a living. When the axe was idle, let's say it's a peaceful year. No wars, no rebellions, no scandals. Which, in medieval Europe, was statistically unlikely, but we'll allow it. The gallows stand empty. The axe hangs on its peg. The executioner sighs and stretches, realizing he still needs to feed his family. So, what did he do? The answer is everything nobody else wanted to do. Executioners were the garbage collectors, animal carcass removers, and general sanitary engineers of the medieval city. If there was a job that involved blood, rot, or bad smells, the executioner probably did it. They cleared away plague corpses, dragged dead animals out of wells, and cleaned up after battles or epidemics. Many of them doubled as butchers, which makes sense since the skill set overlaps somewhat. Some even ran slaughterhouses or tanneries, turning animal hides into leather. It was grim, but practical. You can't live on public executions alone, especially when the local lord was stingy or peace broke out. Unexpectedly, the hangman's other. Job's executioners became a sort of necessary evil, the go-to for anything, morally or physically unpleasant. In some towns, they were responsible for cleaning the latrines. In others, they collected dead dogs or guarded brothels. Some were even responsible for torture, not just executions, meaning they also operated the instruments of interrogation. So, if you were accused of witchcraft, it might have been your local executioner who both extracted your confession and, eventually, carried out your sentence. A grim efficiency of labor, though not exactly a great resume line, but there were quieter duties, too. Executioners sometimes acted as healers. Yes, really. Because for all their bloody reputation, executioners had anatomical knowledge that most people didn't. They knew how muscles worked, how joints moved, and how deep you could cut before someone bled out. So, ironically, people sometimes came to them for medical help, especially when official doctors were too expensive. In 16th century Germany, it was quite common for executioners to moonlight as bone setters or surgeons. In some cases, they were even better at it than the licensed professionals. So yes, the man who executed your cousin last spring might also be the one to fix your broken arm. Sleep well. Living at the edge, executioners lived, quite literally, on the margins. Their houses were usually outside city walls, near the gallows or river crossings. It was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic because they were social outcasts. Practical because it's best to keep your workplace, the site of frequent dismemberment, a safe distance from town. Many executioners' homes were easily recognizable. They often had fenced yards where they kept animals, useful for practicing, perhaps, and sometimes gardens where they grew herbs used for medicine or, more ominously, poisons. Neighbors avoided them, but also needed them. If your pig was sick, you might have to ask the executioner for help slaughtering it. If your cousin was dying painfully, the executioner might know how to end it mercifully. In some places, people left gifts at their door, not out of friendship, but superstition. The idea was that being on the executioner's good side might prevent you from ever needing his services professionally. Family business, executioners' children faced the same stigma. They couldn't easily marry outside their social group because who wanted to marry the hangman's daughter? Though apparently, the hangman's daughter became such a trope that it was used in ballads and legends, usually involving her falling in love with a nobleman who didn't know her father's profession. Spoiler: it never ends well. So, executioner families often married into other executioner families, forming small, closed communities. In some parts of Germany and France, they became known collectively as unehrliche Leute, dishonorable people. That label stuck for generations. Even if an executioner's grandson became a baker, he might still be refused guild membership because of his ancestry. And yet, within their own circles, executioners often had pride in their work. They saw themselves as performing a civic duty, unpleasant, yes, but necessary for justice and hygiene. Someone had to do it after all. The pay wasn't bad. When there was pay, executioners were officially on the city payroll, but their income varied wildly. In some towns, they were paid per execution, a piece rate, if you will. Others got a salary plus extras for torture sessions, cleaning, or animal disposal. Some were even allowed to keep the clothes or belongings of the condemned. A gruesome but practical perk. One executioner in 15th century France reportedly received a chicken for each flogging and a loaf of bread for every branding. Hardly glamorous, but enough to keep the family fed. And then there were tips. Yes, condemned prisoners sometimes tipped the executioner to ensure a clean, quick death. A few coins slipped discreetly into the hangman's palm might mean the difference between a single swift blow and a few unpleasant extra swings. This system, though horrifyingly transactional, became a sort of dark etiquette. Prisoners and executioners often developed a strange, almost professional rapport. After all, they were the last people each other would ever see. The gallows as real estate. In some regions, executioners were granted small plots of land around the gallows, not for sentimental reasons, but for practical ones. Someone had to maintain the site. The area might include a small hut, some grazing land, and of course the wooden structure itself. The executioner was responsible for keeping it in working order. It wasn't unusual for executioners to grow vegetables near the gallows or even hang their laundry there. You have to admire the efficiency, and, strangely, these places sometimes became informal markets. Travelers would stop by, curious or morbidly fascinated, and the executioner might sell them trinkets, talismans, or even relics. Because here's the darker secret. The executioner also dealt in souvenirs. A gruesome side hustle, you see. People believed that the body of a hanged or executed man had magical healing properties. Yes, that's real. Fat from a hanged man's body was used in ointments to treat joint pain. Pieces of rope from a hanging were worn as charms against illness. Even the hand of a thief might be kept as a hand of glory. A sort of medieval burglar's tool that was supposed to freeze people in place. And who better to provide these items than the man in charge of the corpses? Executioners often sold parts of executed bodies to apothecaries, healers, or just curious buyers. It sounds grotesque now, but it was business, and it helped fill those long execution-free months with income. So, when you picture the medieval executioner, don't just think of a grim figure with an axe. Think of a small-time entrepreneur, juggling public service, manual labor, freelance medicine, and an admittedly macabre sideline in corpse-based commodities. He lived apart, worked apart, and even in church, he might be assigned a separate pew at the back, near the door. Some towns refuse to bury executioners in consecrated ground. What did medieval executioners do on their days off? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when public entertainment was a little grimmer. A time when the phrase cutting-edge career could mean something very different. We're talking about the medieval executioner, that shadowy figure in the corner of every old woodcut, carrying something sharp, wearing something ominous, and generally ruining someone's day. But tonight, we're not really interested in the executions themselves. We'll keep those at a respectful, sleepy distance. Instead, we're going to talk about the rest of their lives. The long stretches of time between jobs. Because the truth is, even the busiest medieval hangman didn't spend every day swinging an axe. So what did they do on their days off? What did a man do when he was both necessary and completely despised? Let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and drift back to the Middle Ages, where justice was loud, bloody, and surprisingly administrative. The odd career of the hangman, being an executioner in medieval Europe, was a strange sort of employment. It was official, respectable in the eyes of the law, and yet, socially, it was toxic. Executioners were municipal employees. They were hired, paid, and often housed by the city. In larger towns, they even had assistants, apprentices, and contracts. But their work placed them in a moral gray zone. They carried out justice, but they also touched the condemned, and that was enough to make them untouchable. In the eyes of medieval society, executioners were polluted by their trade. They handled bodies, blood, sin, all the messy byproducts of a society obsessed with purity. So while the local bishop might nod approvingly at their efficiency, he probably wouldn't share a dinner table with them. They were needed, just not invited. Living on the edge, literally, because of their status. Executioners often lived on the literal edge of town, usually near the gallows, or by the river where bodies were dumped. Their houses were sometimes marked, and few people dared to visit. You could almost say they were the human equivalent of the "Do Not Enter" sign. But despite that isolation, their homes were surprisingly well equipped. Cities provided lodging and tools, an axe, rope, and in some cases, a small plot of land. Executioners were also paid per job. A hanging might earn a few shillings. A beheading, more. Torture sessions came with an hourly rate. Some cities even had salary scales. In 14th century Nuremberg, the hangman was paid 8 gulden a year, plus extra for each execution. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, which, in the Middle Ages, was practically luxury. Days between deaths. So, what about the quiet days? When no one was being publicly punished, executioners had to find other ways to make themselves useful. And because few respectable tradesmen would work with blood or bodies, the executioner found his niche in the unclean trades. He became, quite literally, the town's handyman of the unpleasant. He cleaned cesspits. He skinned dead animals. He disposed of corpses that no one else would touch. Plague victims, suicides, criminals. In many places, he doubled as the local knacker, or animal renderer, taking carcasses apart for usable parts. You could say he was both butcher and garbage man, the sanitation department of medieval justice. And if that sounds grim, it actually gave him an odd sort of stability. Executioners rarely starved. They just had to live with the fact that everyone crossed themselves when they walked by. A family. Business? Here's where things get stranger. Executioner wasn't a job you applied for. It was one you inherited. Once a man took the role, his children were effectively trapped in that social category. Nobody wanted to marry a hangman's daughter. Nobody wanted to employ a hangman's son. So executioners married among themselves, generation after generation. The result was a small, interconnected subculture that stretched across Europe. You could find hangmen in Frankfurt, whose cousins worked in Vienna or Prague. They wrote to each other, traded tips, and sometimes filled in for one another when travel was required. If you needed a head expertly removed in Strasbourg, but your local man was ill, someone's cousin from Nuremberg might be summoned. And yes, this was considered networking. The hangman's garden, despite their grim reputations, executioners were often known for their gardens. They cultivated herbs, some medicinal, some not so legal. Because no physician wanted to treat an executioner, they learned to treat themselves. Over time, many developed reputations as informal healers. It was a strange irony. The man who ended lives also knew how to save them. In Nuremberg, the famous executioner Franz Schmidt kept meticulous records of both his executions and his medical treatments. Between 1573 and 1617, he executed 361 people and treated over 15,000 patients. Yes, really. He became so respected as a healer that local nobles secretly consulted him. Of course, publicly, They still pretended not to know him, because etiquette is important. Even when you're visiting your favorite executioner-physician. The hangman's table, socially, life was lonely. Executioners were forbidden from taking communion in church. They weren't allowed to enter public baths, markets, or inns, but the rules didn't apply to other outcasts, so executioners formed their own little communities, social circles of lepers, prostitutes, and gravediggers. A cheerful bunch. Really, they held gatherings, shared food, and in some cases, created their own informal networks of support. It wasn't glamorous, but it was human. And in medieval Europe, that counted for something. The problem of reputation. Every town had its own opinion of its hangman. In some places, he was feared and hated. In others, merely tolerated. And sometimes, oddly enough, admired. A good executioner was efficient, clean, precise. A bad one made a mess, and nothing irritated a medieval crowd quite like an ungraceful beheading. If a head didn't come off cleanly, or if the condemned screamed too long, the hangman might have to flee from the angry mob afterward. So, yes, skill mattered, and reputation followed. There are records of executioners moving between towns, their professional credentials carefully noted, performed with excellence, merciful in method, no unnecessary suffering. Essentially, medieval LinkedIn endorsements. The hangman's wife? It wasn't just the executioner who suffered from stigma. His whole family did. His wife couldn't shop in normal markets. His children were segregated at church. Sometimes they were required to wear distinctive clothing. A quiet reminder of their father's profession, yet within their own circles. Executioners' families developed tight-knit communities. Wives often acted as midwives and herbalists. Again, those gray area healing professions that others avoided. So on market day, you might see the hangman's wife selling herbs to women who pretended not to know her. A quick exchange, averted eyes. A whispered, "Thank you." It was all very medievally awkward. The executioner's apprentice. For those born into the trade, apprenticeship began early. Teenage boys learned the ropes, quite literally. They practiced knot tying, handling livestock, and sometimes anatomy. It wasn't exactly the career most children dreamed of, but it had one advantage: guaranteed employment. Executioners' sons rarely went hungry, and, over time, the profession became more refined. By the 16th century, the best executioners were practically medical specialists, studying anatomy, muscle structure, and efficient methods of dismemberment. One might even call them professionals. If you squinted, leisure and distraction. So what did an executioner do when he wasn't working, healing, or digging pits. Surprisingly, he drank a lot. Alehouses didn't officially welcome him, but some kept back doors open for after-hours visits. A few enjoyed gambling, especially dice, which had a morbid irony about them, a game of chance for a man whose job was all about fate. Others kept animals, dogs, birds, even pigs. It was a lonely life, and companionship had to come from somewhere. And some, like Franz Schmidt, kept journals, detailed records of their work, feelings, and philosophies. Schmidt's diary is oddly reflective. He describes his work with clinical precision, but also with regret. He saw himself as an instrument of justice, not cruelty, and he ended his life quietly, tending a garden, his tools long since put away. The double standard, it's worth remembering that the same society that shunned executioners also relied on them constantly. Medieval justice was theatrical, meant to be seen. Every hanging, every burning, every public punishment served as a warning, and someone had to do the dirty work. But after the show was over, that someone was expected to disappear. You could almost say medieval people outsourced their guilt. They demanded punishment, then exiled the man who provided it. It's a dynamic as old as civilization itself. Shifting times by the 16th and 17th centuries, executioners were becoming more professionalized. They had uniforms, official seals, and salaries. Some even became minor celebrities. The French executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, who would later behead Louis XVII, came from a proud dynasty of hangmen. They were wealthy, educated, and corresponded with intellectuals. But even the Sansons couldn't escape the old stigma. They lived in fine houses, attended the opera, and yet found polite society quietly stepping away when they entered the room. It's hard to shake off a few centuries of social contamination. How did medieval people actually go to the bathroom? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter world. The candles are low, the streets are dark, and the air is thick with, well, humanity. If you're tucked under the covers, perfectly comfortable, maybe sipping some tea, congratulations. Because where we're going, comfort is a very rare thing indeed. Tonight, we're exploring one of the more humbling questions in history. Not war, not empire, not religion, but something far more universal. How did medieval people actually go to the bathroom? It's not a glamorous subject. It's not even a clean one, but it is, perhaps, one of the best ways to understand the Middle Ages. Not through its kings and cathedrals, but through its smells, its improvisations, and its astonishing tolerance for filth. Because if you want to know what life was really like 1,000 years ago, you have to start with the basics. And nothing is more basic than where people went, when they had to go, So, dim your lights, take a slow breath, and let's drift back into a world before plumbing. A world where waste wasn't flushed away. It just stayed. Let's begin in the castle. Now, when you picture a medieval castle, you might imagine glittering halls and roaring fireplaces, but the truth is, they were cold, smoky, and deeply unhygienic. The walls were thick, yes, but they also absorbed centuries of soot and the faint, lingering scent of everyone who had ever lived there, including their bodily functions. Inside these stone fortresses, toilets existed. Sort of. They were called garderobes. A garderobe was a small chamber built into the castle wall, often near the bedchamber or hall. The word itself literally means clothes room, because people sometimes hung their cloaks in there, believing that the ammonia from human waste would kill lice. It did not. Imagine a narrow stone seat with a hole cut into it, leading directly to a vertical shaft that emptied into somewhere, a pit, a moat, or the open air. If you were lucky, your waste dropped into running water. If you weren't, it simply collected at the base of the castle wall, forming a cheerful pile of medieval reality. Servants occasionally cleaned it out, occasionally being the key word there. The smell was constant, of course, but castle inhabitants were accustomed to it. Everyone was. In a time before deodorant, fresh water, or soap as we know it, you didn't notice filth. You simply lived in it, as naturally as breathing. The garderobe experience. Using a garderobe wasn't exactly private. Doors were optional. Some had curtains. And there was no such thing as toilet paper. People wiped with moss, hay, scraps of linen, handfuls of straw, or, if they were fancy, pieces of wool. The wealthy might have imported cloths. The poor might have simply used their hand, and then rinsed it in a nearby bucket. Because of course they did. It wasn't considered strange or shameful. Hygiene was a communal activity, not a private one. People bathed together, slept together, and, on occasion, relieved themselves in groups, particularly when traveling. Imagine the sound of wind whistling through a stone shaft, the faint trickle below, the echo of your own awkward cough. And that's the medieval toilet experience. Romantic, isn't it? Public privies, the medieval solution to urban density. Let's drift from the castle to the bustling medieval town. Here, privacy disappeared completely. Cities like London, Paris, and York were cramped, smelly, and constantly expanding. They had hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, and nowhere for their waste to go. So, they invented the public privy. These were simple wooden sheds built over pits or rivers. You paid a small fee to use one, much like a public bath. Some were surprisingly grand. In 14th century London, one public latrine near the Thames had 84 seats, for men and women alike, separated only by thin partitions. It's not hard to imagine the atmosphere, the faint lapping of the river below, the creak of wooden planks, the quiet, synchronized discomfort of dozens of people sharing one of life's least social moments. And of course, the smell. Always the smell, because human waste was often dropped directly into the water. The same water people used for washing clothes, preparing food, and sometimes even drinking. Medieval towns didn't exactly dispose of sewage. They just moved it around. Cesspits. The hidden danger beneath now. If you were lucky enough to have a home with a private latrine, your waste likely went into a cesspit, a hole dug beneath your property and lined with stones or clay. Think of it as an early septic tank, except with no drainage system and no understanding of bacteria. Cesspits filled up quickly, especially in crowded cities. When that happened, you called for a gong farmer. Yes, that was the real name. Gong meant dung, and a gong farmer's job was to climb into the pit, shovel the waste into buckets, and carry it away at night. They were well paid, because absolutely no one else wanted the job. The smell could linger for days. Their clothes were often burned afterward, and yet these were essential workers, keeping medieval cities just barely livable. They usually dumped the waste outside the city walls, in designated lay stalls, essentially giant medieval compost heaps. And, naturally, when it rained, much of that washed right back into town. Because medieval infrastructure was a delicate ecosystem of optimism and poor planning. Chamber pots, the all-purpose solution. Most people, of course, didn't have a latrine. They used chamber pots, simple ceramic or metal bowls, kept under the bed or beside the hearth. At night, you'd quietly relieve yourself, then set it aside until morning. Servants emptied them out windows, into alleys, or directly onto the street, sometimes with a polite warning, sometimes without. In Paris, there was an official law against throwing waste from windows without shouting, "Garde l'eau!" Literally, watch out for the water. But enforcement was inconsistent. Imagine strolling through a medieval street at dusk, the smell of roasting meat mingling with something much less appetizing, a faint slosh from above, and then, surprise! It was not a good time to be walking below windows. Rivers, moats, and improvised plumbing water was both a blessing and a curse. Cities built along rivers used them as convenient disposal systems. In London, the river fleet ran brown with sewage. The Thames was worse, an open sewer lined with fishmongers, tanners, and butchers, all pouring animal waste into the current. In castles, Moats sometimes served as dumping grounds, not just for intruders, but for everything else, too. This created a particularly fragrant defensive feature. Any enemy trying to cross would not only face arrows, but a layer of thick bacteria-filled sludge. A kind of early chemical warfare, though not intentionally. Bathing and the myth of medieval filth now. You might have heard that medieval people never bathed. That isn't entirely true. In the early Middle Ages, bathhouses were common, especially in towns influenced by Roman traditions. People genuinely enjoyed bathing, and often combined it with socializing or even business meetings. But over time, as plumbing deteriorated and water supplies became contaminated, bathing fell out of favor. By the late Middle Ages, doctors were warning that too much washing opened the pores and let in disease. So instead of washing, people layered perfumes, powders, and clean linen. The wealthy changed shirts frequently. The poor simply endured. Hygiene became a matter of scent management rather than cleanliness, and so the medieval world developed its own equilibrium, a blend of resignation, superstition, and surprisingly good humor about things we'd consider unbearable today. The royal experience. Of course, royalty didn't entirely escape the problem. Kings and queens had their own versions of chamber pots, often made of silver or pewter. Some were even encrusted with jewels, because nothing says luxury like a diamond-studded commode. Their most intimate servants were known as grooms of the stool. Their job was exactly what it sounds like, assisting the monarch with his bodily functions. It was, oddly enough, one of the most powerful positions at court. Because if you're the one holding the king's chamber pot, you're also the one hearing his secrets. In Tudor England, Henry VIII's grooms of the stool were some of his most trusted advisers. They oversaw finances, signed documents, and, yes, occasionally helped with very personal tasks. The position wasn't scandalous. It was prestigious, because proximity to royal waste meant proximity to royal favor. Naturally, the smell of everyday life. It's hard, from our perspective, to imagine just how omnipresent odor was. Streets smelled of manure, fish, rotting food, and human waste. Churches smelled of incense, and the people praying in them. Even the air in castles was thick with smoke, sweat, and latrine drafts. Smell, like noise, fades into the background when it's constant, and, strangely enough, people did have a sense of sanitation, just not ours. They believed in balancing humors, in keeping air sweet, and in avoiding foul smells not for aesthetic reasons, but because they thought bad odors caused disease. In a sense, they weren't wrong, just working with incomplete data, not with reform or justice, but with silence. the survivors simply outlived the madness. They went back to tending their gardens, patching their roofs, mending clothes. Maybe they muttered under their breath about the foolishness of their neighbors. Maybe they just wanted to be left alone. Either way, they remind us of a strange truth about history, that sometimes survival itself is the quietest form of defiance. What happened to witches after the trials ended? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back into a quieter corner of history. A time after the shouting had stopped, after the fires had gone out. The trials were over. The judges had gone home. The towns had moved on to other forms of disappointment, but for a few hundred women and a handful of men, the story didn't end with the verdict. Because once you've been called a witch, it's hard to simply go back to being Martha from the mill, or Agnes from the orchard, or poor Joan who made the mistake of owning a cat. So tonight, we're exploring the lives that came after the hysteria. What happened to the witches who weren't burned, hanged, or drowned? The ones who survived the trials, by luck, by bribes, or by sheer exhaustion on the part of their accusers. What does life look like after you've been condemned by your neighbors, and then released back among them? Let's dim the lights, settle in, and drift back to the late 1600s and early 1700s. The world was changing, slowly, painfully, but changing nonetheless. And somewhere, in the cracks of that transition, lived the survivors of Europe's last great moral panic. The end of the fire. By the late 17th century, the great witch-hunting years were winding down. Europe had burned, drowned, and tortured its way through roughly 2 centuries of fear. Tens of thousands were executed. Mostly women, mostly old, mostly inconvenient, and then suddenly, people just stopped. Not because they became kinder, necessarily, mostly because the trials had become too embarrassing. When half the town ended up accused, including the mayor's wife and the local priest's mother-in-law, it became clear that perhaps the devil wasn't quite that busy. The Enlightenment was creeping in. Rationalism, science, coffee houses. Philosophers started quietly suggesting that maybe thunder came from weather, not demons, and so courts grew hesitant. Judges began to sigh and say, "Yes, yes." But is there any actual evidence that she turned into a toad? The last witch trials in most of Europe fizzled out by the early 1700s. The final executions came a little later, 1750 in Germany, 1775 in Switzerland, and astonishingly, 1782 in the Swiss canton of Glarus, where a poor woman named Anna Goldie was accused of poisoning milk and making a servant girl vomit pins. She was beheaded, not burned, because progress, but after her, even the most superstitious magistrates realized that the whole witch-burning business was beginning to look unfashionable. And so it ended. Sort of. The aftermath nobody wanted. When the trials stopped, there were survivors, and those survivors had to go home. Imagine being released after months in a dungeon, bones aching, hair falling out from malnutrition, and stepping back into the same muddy street where your neighbors had just testified that you were in league with Satan. Some returned to find their homes sold. Others found their husbands remarried, on the reasonable assumption that they'd been burned alive. A few had their children taken by the parish for protection. It's not exactly a triumphant ending. In some cases, villages offered small payments to the falsely accused, essentially hush money, a few shillings to encourage everyone to stop talking about it. In others, people were quietly told to move away. Because forgiveness is a beautiful thing in theory, but rather awkward in practice when you're the one who lit the match. Drifting back into daily life. Let's drift over to England. Around 1710, by now, witch trials were mostly a memory. But superstition lingered in the corners of everyday life like the smell of old smoke. Survivors often became local curiosities. The witch who got away. Some were half feared, half pitied. People might still slip charms under their doorsteps to ward them off, just in case. Milk spoiled? Blame her? Baby sick? Definitely her fault. The price of grain fell? You can probably guess who the villagers side-eyed at the market. For many women, the only way to survive was to lean into it. If everyone already thought you were a witch, you might as well start selling herbal remedies. A few of these women actually became local healers again, the very role that had gotten them in trouble to begin with. It's a strange kind of redemption, condemned for using herbs, then quietly respected for the same skill once everyone forgot the panic. Others withdrew completely. They lived on the edges of villages, supported by distant relatives or the church's reluctant charity. It's hard to make friends when half the village once tried to drown you. Is he? Weight of silence the most haunting? Part of these stories is how little was said afterward. Communities didn't like to remember. In some villages, the records were deliberately destroyed. Court transcripts were burned, names erased. No one wanted to explain to their grandchildren that Grandma's best friend was hanged for talking to a crow. Even the churches, once so enthusiastic about rooting out evil, quietly moved on. Sermons turned to gentler topics: salvation, morality, not witchcraft. It was an unspoken agreement. This was a collective embarrassment, and it was best left behind. But for the survivors, silence could be its own punishment. They lived out their lives in communities pretending not to notice them. unwelcome reminders of a time when everyone had lost their minds. Scotland. The reluctant believers now. Let's drift northward to Scotland. The Scots were enthusiastic witch hunters, over 2,000 executions, and a national tendency to see the devil lurking behind every bad harvest. But even in Scotland, the fervor eventually cooled. By the early 18th century, ministers who once preached about witches were awkwardly changing the subject. The survivors there faced particularly cold receptions. Many were elderly and impoverished. Parish councils debated whether to offer them alms, or whether that would look like condoning witchcraft. A few small communities even wrote to Edinburgh asking for permission to retry witches, this time just to clear their names. The government never responded. Bureaucracy moves slowly, even in matters of sorcery. In some parishes, families of the accused quietly tried to rejoin local life. They married, took new names, and pretended nothing had happened. But the stigma could last generations. Even in the 19th century, Scottish folklorists recorded villages where children still whispered that old Maggie's grandmother was a witch, because rumor, like magic, never really dies. It just changes form. Germany, bureaucracy and shame across the Holy Roman Empire. Witch trials had been particularly brutal. Tiny principalities competed to outdo each other in moral cleanliness, which, as it turns out, mostly meant setting women on fire. When it all ended, the paperwork began. German states were nothing if not meticulous. Officials catalogued who had been executed, who had confessed, and who had recanted. For the survivors, there were petitions, stiffly written appeals for restitution. One from 1709 survives in Westphalia, written by a woman named Katharina Küchler. She'd been accused, tortured, and released when the court finally realized she had no magic powers, just a bad temper and an unlucky goat. She asked the magistrate for her confiscated property back. The response was polite, but firm. The assets had been legally redistributed, which is 18th century bureaucracy for someone else lives in your house now. New England's ghosts across the Atlantic. In Salem, Massachusetts, the story was oddly similar, but with a Puritan twist. After the hysteria of 1692, the colony was mortified. Judges issued apologies. Jurors expressed regret. And the Massachusetts government eventually granted compensation to the families of the dead. The survivors, though received little comfort. One woman, Elizabeth Proctor, was spared execution because she was pregnant. When she gave birth in prison, she was quietly released, but never officially cleared. She lived another 40 years, raising children who carried the weight of that shame. Her descendants, ordinary farmers, ministers, and shopkeepers, kept the story quiet for generations. You wouldn't mention that Grandma was almost hanged for witchcraft. It wasn't considered good for business. The economics of the accusation, it's easy to forget that witch trials weren't just about fear. They were about money. Accused witches had to pay for their own imprisonment. They paid the jailers, the wood for the pyre, even the ropes. If they died, their families inherited the debt. So when the trials ended, survivors were often destitute. Some turned to begging. Others became minor curiosities, tolerated but never trusted. One woman in Germany was nicknamed the Fire Dodger. Children followed her through the streets, chanting rhymes. She outlived them all, dying in her 90s, a reminder of a time the village wanted desperately to forget. The quiet transformation over time. The idea of the witch changed. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the witch became less a figure of fear and more one of folklore. Artists painted them as mysterious old crones. Writers romanticized them. Wise women wronged by ignorant men. It was easier to love them as myths than to face what had been done to the real ones. And somewhere beneath that mythology lived the remnants of the old accusations. Families who remembered, but didn't speak. Even today, in parts of rural Europe. Una tada bidundrid. You can find old houses with tiny marks carved into the woodwork. Witch marks, meant to keep evil out. A bit of superstition that outlasted the people it condemned. The last generation, by the early 1800s, the last living witches of Europe were dying out. Not the ones who practiced magic, but the ones who had been named as witches during their lifetime. The quiet power behind the curtain. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the quiet, candle-lit corridors of power. The sort that smelled faintly of incense, old silk, and bad decisions. If you've tucked yourself in, dimmed the lights, and silenced the modern world for a little while. Perfect. Because tonight's story isn't about kings or queens, not exactly. It's about the men who served them, guarded them, manipulated them, and sometimes became them in all but name. They were eunuchs, the castrated courtiers who ruled from the shadows. And yes, that's an uncomfortable word to start a bedtime story with. But bear with me. It's a strangely tranquil topic once you get past the first wince, because these were the people who learned to survive in the deadliest places on earth. Royal courts, where a misplaced glance could mean exile, and a whispered rumor could turn into a beheading before breakfast. So, what happened to the eunuchs who ran empires? Let's drift back to the beginning. Part 2. The Origins. A Convenient Absence. The idea of removing a man's ability to reproduce in exchange for trust is almost as old as civilization itself. It appeared first in the dusty bureaucracies of ancient Mesopotamia, the kind of world where clay tablets held grocery lists, and job applications could include loyal and unlikely to seduce the queen. Eunuchs were perfect for that sort of job. They couldn't start rival dynasties. They couldn't impregnate concubines. And they couldn't, theoretically, betray their masters for personal gain. Theoretically. In reality, they became some of the most ruthless politicians in history. By the time the Persian Empire came along, eunuchs were already standard equipment in palaces. Herodotus, who never missed an opportunity to gossip, noted how they were trusted with the most delicate assignments: espionage, treasury management, and occasionally assassination. In the ancient world, being a eunuch wasn't so much a tragedy as it was a career path. A violent one, yes, but in an empire where sons of nobles fought over titles, the eunuch was the one man in the room with no heirs to feed, only ambition. Part 3. The Byzantine Specialists. Let's drift forward a few centuries, past the Romans, who tried it and mostly found it distasteful, to their eastern cousins, the Byzantines. Byzantium, the empire that turned bureaucracy into religion. The Byzantines adored eunuchs. To them, these were the perfect administrators, calm, meticulous, unencumbered by lust or lineage. At least, that was the theory. History suggests they were often as lusty and conniving as everyone else, just differently motivated. The Byzantine palace was essentially a hive of them. Some guarded the imperial bedchambers. Others sang in the cathedral choirs, since their altered voices could reach unearthly high notes. But the most powerful eunuchs, those were the parakoimomenoi, the chamberlains who literally slept outside the emperor's bedroom door. One of them, a man named Basil Lekapenos, ran the empire for nearly 40 years in the 10th century. He was the illegitimate son of an emperor, born before his father had him. Well, edited, and he outlasted 5 emperors, all of whom probably wished they'd been half as clever. Basil's life was a masterclass in subtle survival. He bribed, flattered, and quietly removed rivals until he was effectively prime minister. His secret weapon was his invisibility. He wasn't a threat to the throne, so no one ever thought to fear him, until they did. In the end, he died old, rich, and peacefully, which in Byzantine terms was practically sainthood. Part 4. The Song Dynasty's silver-tongued shadows now. If Byzantium made eunuchs powerful, China turned it into an art form. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, imperial eunuchs had become indispensable, the gatekeepers between the emperor and the world. The average citizen might never see the Son of Heaven, but they might hear about him through the whispering network of eunuchs who carried his orders, gifts, and gossip. In the 9th century, the Tang court discovered what happens when you give a man unlimited access to both information and the emperor's ear. Eunuchs began selling appointments, controlling armies, and deciding who lived or died. One emperor, Tang Xianzong, trusted his eunuchs so completely that they eventually killed him, for reasons historians still debate. Possibly because he started thinking about firing them, which, in hindsight, was an unwise managerial decision. The Song emperors, perhaps learning from that unfortunate event, tried to keep their eunuchs in check. They failed. It's hard to regulate people who know everything about you, including the exact contents of your medicine cabinet and your sleeping habits. Part 5. The Ming Dynasty's Golden Age of Eunuchs. Let's drift gently onward to the Ming Dynasty, the golden age of Chinese eunuch power, and the closest thing the world has ever seen to an empire run by them. The most famous of them all was Zheng He, the admiral who led China's great treasure, fleets across the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century. Imagine him, a 7-foot-tall Muslim eunuch commanding hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors, visiting ports from Java to Zanzibar, all while technically being the property of the emperor. It's the kind of paradox only China could perfect. The servant of the Son of Heaven, who commanded a fleet larger than any navy on earth. And then there was Wei Zhongxian, a very different kind of eunuch. He rose from gambling debts and obscurity to become the de facto ruler of the Ming court under the Tianqi emperor. He controlled access to the throne, had temples built in his honor, and executed anyone who suggested that perhaps he was getting a little overconfident. Naturally, when the emperor died, Wei's enemies moved fast. He was ordered to commit suicide, which he did reluctantly. His temples were torn down, his statues smashed, and his name became a byword for corruption. Even for a man who'd already lost everything once, that was quite a fall. The Ottoman palace and the black eunuchs now. If we drift west again, past deserts and minarets, we reach the Ottoman Empire, where eunuchs reached their most visible and paradoxical prominence. In Istanbul, the Sultan's harem was the most restricted space in the world, a labyrinth of women, silk curtains, and politics. The only men allowed inside were the Kuzlar Ayası, the chief black eunuch, and his carefully chosen subordinates. Most were enslaved boys from East Africa, castrated in transit, and sold to palace officials. The work was dangerous, the mortality rate appalling. But for the survivors, the reward was unimaginable power. The chief black eunuch controlled not just the harem, but often the flow of imperial decrees. He could make or break viziers, influence marriages, and even decide who would become the next sultan. One of the most powerful, Hacı Aya, served for nearly 40 years in the 18th century. He built mosques, endowed libraries, and quietly reshaped Ottoman politics from the heart of the palace. When he died, he was buried with honors usually reserved for princes. For a man who had begun life as property, it was an almost miraculous reversal. But power built on proximity is fragile. When new regimes arose, the Ming replaced by the Qing, the Ottomans by modern reformers, the Byzantines finally conquered. Eunuchs vanished almost overnight. Their power depended entirely on the existence of a single, secluded ruler, a man who needed protection from the outside world. When kings became figureheads and bureaucracies modernized, eunuchs became unnecessary. In China, the last imperial eunuch, Sun Youting, died in 1996. He'd served the last emperor, Puyi, as a boy. By the time he was old, he lived quietly in a tiny Beijing apartment, watching his former empire vanish into skyscrapers and smog. He once said he still dreamed of the Forbidden City. The sound of silk slippers, the faint scent of sandalwood, the emperor's voice echoing through the halls. In a way, that's where they all stayed, in those corridors of half-light, the quiet men who ruled without ever being seen. And that, in the end, might be the most haunting thing about them. They built empires, toppled dynasties, commanded armies, and yet they left no heirs, no bloodlines, no monuments of their own. Their power evaporated the moment they died. Maybe that's what made them so dangerous and so fascinating. They had nothing to lose and nowhere to belong except the palace. They were, in every sense, the perfect servants and the most quietly terrifying masters. So, as you drift off tonight, maybe think of them, the forgotten architects of empires, men who ruled from behind silk curtains, who outlived kings, and who disappeared into history without a trace of their own. The world remembers their emperors, their queens, their wars, but not the calm voice whispering in the ruler's ear, saying softly, "Into pits, rivers, pots, or down castle shafts." They wiped with what was handy. They smelled as they lived, and they accepted it all as the way of the world. For them, sanitation wasn't a moral issue. It was just another part of life's cycle, one that began and ended in the same earth, the same river, the same street. And though we like to think of ourselves as more advanced, there's something almost comforting about that simplicity. No plastic pipes, no porcelain thrones, just people, doing what people have always done, and getting on with their day. And with that, we'll pause for a moment. Right here, between the garderobes and the chamber pots. In the next part, we'll drift through the medieval bathhouse, the rise of the plague cleaning industry, and the surprising role of saints and superstition in medieval hygiene.